The question of innocence has been a fascination of late. Of course, it's been human fascination for time immemorial, but for me, it's been a particular, almost to the point of obsession. After finishing Voldeinsamkeit, that has been one of the questions most on my mind. What is innocence? How can it exist? How is it lost? And what can it be? Not what is the sort of innocence with which we have experience. What we generally mean referentially when we talk about innocence is the ignorance of the world and ignorance of ourselves that we experienced in childhood, and we generally analogize innocence to that, perhaps because it is the closest analog that we can connect to. But I don't think that's what innocence is. And even if it is what innocence is, that does not mean that that is the only form of innocence that exists. I think, and I feel very strongly, that innocence, in the poetic sense at least, rather than being a knowledge problem, is more of an ethos problem. That rather than it being the sense of wonder, and I mean, many of us are desperate to reclaim a sense of wonder, rather than being a sense of wonder founded in ignorance of the world, as if to say that knowledge of the world is to hate it. That knowledge necessarily informs a specific aesthetic position. I object to that on every front. And that is generally how we regard the question of innocence. Rather than that, though, I'm increasingly inclined to think that innocence has more to do with how we relate to ourselves, how we correspond, our decisions, our ethics, our aesthetics, and our identities. That if innocence is something, that if there is something that we can point to and say that is innocence, it is the convergence of those things, where our ethics, our aesthetics, our intellect, and our sense of self kind of meet, where they act in unison rather than acting as contrary forces. And it's easy to see, given that, how we would correspond the ignorance of how we would correlate the ignorance of childhood to that kind of state, because not knowing ethics, being ignorant of one's ethics, aesthetics, abstractions, and ignorant of oneself and the relationship between oneself and the world, that convergence could be all-consuming, because it's all in a great big gray blot on the map that says, I don't know, which covers most of the map. And so in that convergence is very easy in ignorance. And in knowledge, much more difficult, but not impossible. Not impossible. And so I've been increasingly fascinated and caught up in thinking about innocence, a state of innocence that is informed by experience, rather than being informed by the absence thereof.